and then we should be good to go. Awesome. Just give me a sec here. Webinar on everything from casuals to entitlements and the IR changes we've probably all heard about now after the Prime Minister's speech earlier this week. My name's Matthew Elmas. I'm the news editor at Smart Company, and I'm happy to be joined today by the Australian Small Business Ombudsman, Kate Carnell, and Employsure's Ed Mallett today. We're going to be talking about a range of topics across industrial relations and that sort of nature. We've got about an hour and we'll take some questions as well. Please leave your questions in the Facebook comments rather than the webinar comments, and that'll ensure we can get to them and see if we can get them answered for you. There are a lot of people that are going to be asking questions, so if we don't get to everybody, we do apologise, but don't hesitate to send us an email and we'll try to follow up with you as best we can. Why don't we just jump straight into things? Kate, thanks so much for joining us today. I wanted to start with you. The Prime Minister said earlier this week that it's time for unions and employer groups to put down their weapons and come to some consensus on IR changes. What, in your view, are the stakes here for SME owners as we head into these consultations?
Look, Matthew, this is absolutely fundamental. As we know, the current system is incredibly complex for everybody. And I think some of the fascinating bits of recent times, and I know, Ed would know this too, is that the number of very large businesses that have simply got this wrong as well. And those are big businesses with HR areas, with people who do the payroll, with lawyers, with accountants, even companies, even entities like the ABC have got paying their casuals wrong. So how do we expect small businesses operating under the same legislation as big businesses with over 100 awards as well to actually get this right? The Fair Work Act's 960 sections, 250,000 words, and there's over 100 awards as well. And in lots of small businesses, there's people potentially working in a number of different awards, certainly in different classifications under the same award. So why does this matter? It matters because this stuff scares small businesses, They think, oh dear, if I employ someone, I'm going to end up with an unfair dismissal claim if this thing doesn't work. If for some reason the person I employ, doesn't work out, or the business doesn't track the way I think, I'm not going to be able to get rid of them, and therefore I just won't employ. If we want to come out the other side of this thing, and we do, all of us do, we've got to make it a whole lot simpler and more flexible for small businesses to employ, and importantly, to shed staff if that's what has to happen. Because if they don't have the capacity to do that, they won't employ in the first place. Because nobody really knows what the world post-COVID looks like. So it's really challenging, to employ in this time frame.
Sure. And Ed, there's sort of, I suppose, broad agreement here that there's going to need to be some coming to the middle on some of these more thornier issues, award simplification or changes to the award system being one of them. Where do you think, sort of unions or employer groups are going to really have to meet each other in the middle here to get a sort of solution that could sort of assist SMEs with some of the issues that they're having?
So, thanks, Matt. I think that there's a bit of a gap between what's being proposed to be discussed and what matters to small business at the moment. So you mentioned their enterprise bargaining, for example. So there's about 10,000 enterprise agreements in the whole of Australia. There are about 1 million employers in Australia, the vast majority of whom are small businesses with less than, say, 15 staff. The average number of employees on an enterprise agreement is 150. So enterprise agreements are big business stuff. And we keep hearing it in the media that There's going to be discussion about the boot test and other confusing concepts that small businesses frankly don't get, nor should they have to spend the time trying to work out. What they really need is a clear understanding of a very simple safety net that I think we all agree no one wants to condone bad behaviours like trying to rort staff or underpay them in any way. But what I see day to day is a very confusing system, as Kate pointed out. It's extensive, it's mind-bogglingly difficult for people to follow. For me, any system which so consistently has very simple problems like underpayment of wages, and let's face it, that's the most basic thing that you need to get right in the workplace. Someone provides you labour, you provide them with remuneration in response to that, and getting that right number is so often so hard for businesses that they end up getting it wrong, then that's a broken system. So I'd much rather that we started at the bottom in that regard rather than jumped into big business issues. And I just worry that the 5 items that were laid down as things that are going to be discussed, the majority of them are big business things, not small business things.
Matthew, could I just come in there? Look, that's really true. And I think the thing that we often forget is there's lots of overpayments as well as underpayments. The only ones we hear about are the underpayments. And the reason for that is when the Fair Work Ombudsman does an audit, they don't look for overpayments and they don't actually report on them. They only report when you've underpaid because then you haven't complied with the award or the act. So it's not right to say that small businesses only underpay or businesses only underpay. That's not the case. In fact, a couple of years ago, the Fair Work Ombudsman had a bit of a look at this and determined that a very large number of small businesses paid a bit more, a bit more per hour so that maybe they wouldn't get it wrong. The problem that doesn't fix it. It means that everyone's paid a bit more than the award says they have to be. But even if you just get that one person wrong who works an unusual, set of hours, you haven't complied. And that's the problem.
And wage theft is certainly going to be considered in these consultations. I think that, the fact of systemic wage theft has sort of reared its head in the last 6 months especially. I know, Kate, you've suggested a sort of specific award for small businesses that could sort of exist within the current system largely and would provide a sort of way for small businesses to escape the existing award system. In what ways do you think that award system could be considered as part of the upcoming consultations? And do you think there's prospect that unions would be satisfied they could address some of the concerns about workers being ripped off, especially in those high-risk sectors like hospitality and retail?
Look, that's the whole point of the exercise, is to make it simpler for small businesses to do the right thing. Now, I'd hope the unions were really positive about helping small businesses to do the right thing and to be able to pay people, what they're supposed to be paid, not pay them less than the award says they should be. And that's what we're trying to do. Now, it could be a standalone new award, or it could be an add-on to current awards, a small business addition, shall we say, to current awards. And it's particularly the case in areas that operate outside the usual 9 to 5, Monday to Friday space. In awards where most people work those sort of hours aren't where the mistakes happen. They happen where, you're operating lots of, longer times, 24/7. There's home visits, community nurses, community service. We always think about hospitality and events and fast food and so on, but there's a whole range of people who work outside normal business hours, shall we say now. In fact, most, a very large number now do, because what's standard business hours anymore? That's becoming less and less, the norm. So what we're trying to do is say, let's make it easy for businesses to pay what they're supposed to pay, regardless of what of what the scope of their hours are, unless, of course, they work more than 38 hours a week. We're still, you should be paid loading if you're working more than standard hours. But should you end up in trouble simply because, you've got people on different awards and the one award says standard starting time is 6 a.m., the other award is 7 a.m., and one award says you've got to have 3 hours before the first break, and the other one says you've got to have 2 hours, and they just don't work in your business at all, and you're inevitably going to get it wrong. So let's try to make it simple.
And Ed, part of this process is seeking compromise and consensus. There's a lot of talk about the wage theft problem, as we've discussed. And it seems likely the unions are going to push the government for tougher penalties for people that do the wrong thing on purpose or who are trying to fraud the system as it exists. Do you think that perhaps award simplification could be seen as part of a trade-off for tougher penalties for trying to do the wrong thing within the system?
So I'm first of all going to jump on that phrase wage theft, which funnily enough, I haven't heard it for a few weeks with the crisis. And,
it's been a relief.
Yeah, suddenly the heckles have gone up on the back of my neck again. It sounds like Kate and I are probably on a two-person or more crusade to say, I hate the stigmatization of the way people are being said to underpay their staff. That we consult with thousands of small businesses, and I have yet to see in the 10 years that we've been going someone trying to underpay their staff. And maybe those guys don't become our clients because they're not wanting to do the right thing, and maybe they do exist somewhere, but they're certainly not the preponderance in the business community. And this idea of theft, and this is me dusting off old law studies from my lectures years ago, but theft has an element of intent, and you've intended to do the wrong thing. And I'd have no problem, and I don't think anyone would have a problem with people finding that they are punished where they have intent, just as they would be under criminal standards for theft and other criminal things. But what I really don't like is people being swept up in that net where they are the victims of a very, and this is a controversial thing to say, I could say it in my position as a private business owner, it's easier to say, I suppose, but I don't think it's fair where people are caught up and they're in a tricky system, in a broken system, and they're made out to be the perpetrators of a crime, when really they are victims, just as their employees are, because their employees should have a system where they can get paid the right wages easily. And I'd be very supportive of a much simpler system, whether it's a small business award or, as you see in most developed economies, and my accent might be fading a bit, but I'm not from around here. And back in the UK, where I am from, all you have is one single minimum wage, and then you let market economics work out over and above that how much people should be paid. So when people from the UK come here and they see the award system, just like I was, you end up being completely mind-boggled about it and saying, is this serious that you have a different minimum wage for every different job, essentially? It's utterly perplexing.
And different bits of the same award. You've got, categories, you've got different wages, you've got all sorts of things. And it's important to say here, Matthew, because I think most Australians don't realise that we are unique. Australia has this award system that no one else has. New Zealand used to once upon a time, but they got, they moved closer to the UK system. They deregulated. So we're really, really unusual to have this level of complexity.
And on that note, and I want to sort of move along to casual entitlements. That's obviously will be a big subject in these upcoming talks, and we had some developments on that front a few weeks ago with another federal court ruling essentially finding that, long-term casuals not only probably entitled to back payment claims on leave, but that employers probably wouldn't be able to use casual loadings to offset those claims. That's caused a big uproar in the industrial relations space. What do you really think, really needs to be talked about around casual entitlements as we move forward in these discussions? And what are the pain points in this area for SMEs, Kate?
Well, first of all, we're going to have to do something about this. I mean, certainly the retrospectivity issue is real, but I want to talk about going forward a bit, because
Right.
what those particular cases, the Rosato and the Skeen case said was that if you employ people with, regular, certain, continuing, predictable work hours, then they are employed as other than casuals, to use, classic legal talk. But fundamentally, what it means is for the very large amount of casuals I employed in my business back in pharmacy land, including myself, by the way, I worked Friday night and Saturdays all the way through uni at the local pharmacy, because that was when I was available and they were open. Now, with this sort of scenario, probably I was working, predictable, continuous, constant, planned hours for over 6 months, over 12 months, in fact, for close to 3 years, really. Now, that's what it looks like out there. I was also paid a 25% loading because I perceived I was a casual. So what we've got going forward here is that what the court cases are saying is that businesses can't employ people casually, pay the 25% loading, and have predictable, planned shifts. They're saying, okay, casuals, we're going to have to make all of your shifts unplanned, unpredictable, not something that you can plan going forward. So you can't get your mum to look after the kids 3 mornings a week because that's when your shifts are on. So we can't do that. You can't be a casual if you have regular shifts. So we're going to have to move you onto permanent part-time. And guess what? You're going to take home 25% less. Who's a winner out of this? I have no idea. Right. So I suppose that's the reason we think it's going to need to be fixed.
Right. And Ed, with the need for consensus in these upcoming talks, where do you think the ball's really going to fall on where casual employment ends up? Unions obviously are very keen on casuals getting some kind of leave entitlement, and employers obviously not very happy at the prospect of paying for those leave entitlements on top of casual loadings.
Yeah, it's where do I think it will end up? We've been waiting for that question for a long time. As Kate mentioned, there's a case called Skeen, which actually did what this case Rosato did 2 years ago, and we've been waiting to see whether that was going to be overturned. So Rosato is a disappointing decision for both employers and employees. I think it's a lose-lose. Kate fairly makes one point, which is that if people are transitioned to part-time, they'll earn less per hour, potentially will. But also, if I'm an employee in the current environment and my employer might be needing to make cost reductions in the coming months, and I've just found out I'm the most expensive person there because I get leave loading and there's a leave liability, that feels like a lot of risk for me as an employee, as me probably being at the front of the queue when the employer comes to do cost cutting. So I don't think this serves anyone well. A couple of quick points on it, that Rosato, interestingly, and coming back to something Kate said earlier about overpayment, interestingly, in that case, so this is a guy working on a mine site who was being well overpaid over awards. So he was getting much, much more than the government says he should get relative to his role. But on top of that, he was seeking this annual leave entitlement. So it's quite interesting that overpayment exists there. But also another thing Kate would have seen, and we see here, is small business stories that are coming out of this in terms of looking into that crystal ball now for a solution. So we're repeatedly hearing small businesses saying, what's the point? I've had fires, I've had COVID, I've had drought, and now you're telling me that someone that's always wanted to be a casual on my books, I owe them extra money. And there's a lack of clarity as to how far back I've got to go, how big that liability will be. It's all too confusing. And then second to that, and related to that, I also repeatedly see small business owners who have had the transition conversation with their long-term casuals. So they have said to them, would you like to turn into a permanent employee, be it full-time or part-time? And the casual, for reasons like Kate with her job in the pharmacy, have said, no, I don't want to, because it doesn't provide me with the same level of flexibility. By the way, I like the loading. And there seems to be, I think, a misapprehension. I don't know, again, whether that's this big business, small business disconnect. But certainly what I hear in small business land is that people want to be casuals.
Right.
And I think it's a bit nannyist, to be honest, to turn around and say, we've got to protect these guys. Right. They're so vulnerable, they're being rorted. When actually most small business owners I speak to say this is very much a matter of choice. So I'm not sure we'll get to any form of consensus until people understand the landscape properly.
Can I just make two? Sorry.
Sure.
Can I just make 2 points on that, Matthew? I absolutely agree with Ed. My mum, who's worked 3 mornings a week for me in my pharmacy, and the reason she's working 3 mornings a week is because that's when a mum can look after the kids. Really common casual. Why does she want to work as a casual? Because she can knock back a shift. So when the kids are sick or, you know, something's happening at home, she can say, look, Kate just can't work, you know, next Tuesday, next Wednesday, what it might be. And that's absolutely fine. She's a casual. Casuals can say no to shifts. Not so easy for permanent employees. They've got to fit under leave entitlement type scenarios. So there's a lot of casuals who want to be able to knock back a shifts. Lots of university students who want to be able to say, look, I'm just not going to work during university holidays or when, you know, exams are on or whatever. That's what casuals can do. It's not what permanent employees can do. But in our recommendations to the government, we've said there does need to be, we believe, a permanent part-time flexible gig, which we call permaflexi. I know, you know, the New South Wales Business Chamber has put that up as well. Just think there needs to be a capacity to have a flexible, permanent, part-time category, which doesn't exist at the moment.
Sure. And I suppose the follow-on from that is that there seems to be widespread agreement that, you know, the way casual work is defined in the Fair Work Act and the way it's playing out in the economy in real time are quite different. And that's where some of these issues are arising from. And sort of more broadly on the union side, there's concern that, you know, workers' options are becoming limited, and there's a broader and perhaps structural casualisation happening in the workforce that is over time seeing worker benefits and conditions eroded to some extent. Where, Ed, do you see a potential compromise on that point where employers could, I suppose, have the flexibility they need to continue using casual work, and those employees that benefit from that kind of arrangement can have it without sort of this broader fear that sort of with gig economy and all of these things, it's getting a lot harder for the workforce to come across stable work that they can sort of, you know, not need to go into work when they're sick, or, you know, they might have symptoms of COVID-19 or coronavirus, for example, and feel like they have to come into work because they can't get paid sick leave, for example.
Yeah, good question. I think that the best way to answer those questions is always to start with the data points on it. Now, I don't think anyone in business land is proposing some sort of shift back to some Dickensian system where people are getting terrible benefits, if any, and treated badly at work. And equally, I think we've got to be a bit careful not to rush forward to this whole world of gig economies where no one really has a job, and we all that's a future state that I'm not sure we'll ever really get to. Funnily enough, I think the crisis is actually going to slow forward the development towards that future state. I think that we'll see much more reliance and understanding on how important jobs are to our social fabric and working in workplaces and things like that. So I think that future is a long way off. So it shouldn't be held up as something that we should all be scared of. So then going back to those data points, that the actual casualisation of the workforce over the last 20 years, it hasn't actually shifted at all percentage-wise. So we've got more casual workers because we have more workers, but it's roughly, and Kate, tell me if I'm wrong on this, but I think it's about 20% of the workforce.
It is 20% for the last 20 years. That's the case.
So it seems it's one of those narratives that's become quite attractive because it does sound as though in a circumstance where someone fears that they may have COVID and therefore takes time off and gets no pay, that does seem like it might be unfair. But I think you can always pick on individual examples in any scenario to create a narrative where the better narrative is to look at the data as your starting point.
And oh no, go ahead, Kate.
When we talk about the gig economy, we're really talking about small business people, aren't we? We're talking about people with an ABN that have decided to work for themselves. So I think we shouldn't see it as something horribly different. They are people who have decided that they're going to have their own business. They might be Uber drivers. They might be people who work part-time. As I met a guy the other day as a hospital wardsman, works a bit of time there, but has his own business in the, you could argue, in the gig space. He's doing it because he wants to do it. It's something that he believes is great. There's an awful lot of people who are running businesses on the eBays, the Amazons and so on, who are in the supposed gig space. So I think the important bit is to understand we've always had owner-operators. We've always had people who've started up their own business, got their own ABN and operated, as individual small businesses. The thing that's changed is we've now got platforms that lots of gig economy operators work on, like eBay and Amazon and Uber and so on. And it means that they can get better linkages with customers via a platform than they could have just on their own. And that's actually made for lots of people making a lot of money, actually. So we shouldn't assume that these are people who are really, at the bottom of the rung. It means for lots of people, they've had an opportunity, to really grow a business and to make money with their delivery truck or whatever other thing they're using in the gig space.
One thing I wanted to touch on briefly before we go to questions is sort of unfair dismissal. Now that's not going to be a topic of any of the working groups coming up, but I know, Kate, that you've sort of released some views on that in the past and suggested that similar to there being creating a small business award, we could create an unfair dismissal process suited for small businesses that could help address some of the perceived complexities in that area. Could you, I suppose, explain, why you think that can play a role in the upcoming changes the government is sort of pursuing?
Look, Matthew, it's really interesting that when the Fair Work Act was passed, I think under Julia Gillard initially, or maybe it was Kevin Rudd initially, and then Julia put through some amendments. But back in those days, it was understood right from the beginning that the unfair dismissal parts of the Fair Work Act were going to be pretty onerous for small businesses. So right from the beginning, there was a fair dismissal code inside the Fair Work Act. That was then amended, I think, by Julia Gillard when it was determined that it actually needed some help to work properly. So it's always existed. The problem with it is it hasn't really changed the quite significant number of unfair dismissal applications, over 3,500 of them, and the fear that small businesses have that they're going to end up with an unfair dismissal claim. So the changes that we've put on the table are changes to give small business confidence that if they follow the approach that's in the code, that they'll be okay, that they won't end up with an unfair dismissal claim.
I suppose the point there being is that you could sort of come to a consensus with, employee advocates about what should be in that code, and then it's really not as much about changing the balance of power in unfair dismissal. It's just about having a document that can provide clarity about how it needs to occur, and whatever that is can be decided on. Ed, on that note, with the fair dismissal code, I think we're seeing, as Kate said, thousands of these unfair dismissal cases come through, and most of them are dismissed by the Fair Work Commission because they find that there's not a case there under the reading of the Fair Work Act. Do you think that there needs to be reform to this unfair dismissal system as it currently exists? And what's your experience of that system from your position?
So my experience is very direct, first of all, in the sense that I run a business that was founded in 2010 when the Fair Work Act came into place, and we serve small businesses. And the reality is that we exist at the scale we exist at now because of problems small businesses face, like unfair dismissal. So prior to the Fair Work Act, they couldn't be sued for unfair dismissal. That suddenly came in and created, for me, coming from the UK, I could see that already happening in the UK with small business there, and I realised how much of a pain it would be for them, and it's certainly become that. Again, if I go back to a brief spectrum on this as well, it's at one end of the spectrum in terms of looking at other countries. This is to try and find a good solution. You've got the US, which most states in the US are what they call fire at will, which sounds particularly unpleasant, and I don't think anyone here in their right mind would be proposing going there. Because funnily enough, even if you do have that situation, all you do is you get different types of claims. So you end up with loads of discrimination claims in the US, because they'd say, well, you fired me, and it must have been because of my gender, race, religion, whatever it might be. And they say they get a spike in those claims. Australia, as it used to be, with no risk to small businesses for unfair dismissal, is somewhere down that end of the spectrum. Then you get to the UK in the middle, in which they added some, I suppose, hurdles in which to make claims, which became quite problematic. So you had to write a written grievance in order to make a claim. So try and resolve it internally first, which became quite problematic. Then you have at the other end of the spectrum in Australia, where the protections are pretty high currently for employees. And probably one stage beyond that is New Zealand. So New Zealand unfair dismissal laws and the way in which you'd make a claim. It's actually, I could say this as an employer, both here in Australia and in New Zealand. It's very, very difficult in New Zealand to manage a workforce. It's also very different in Australia. So I'd like to see it shift along the spectrum slightly. It's got nothing to do with my heritage, but somewhere closer to the UK system, where there is a level of protection and you can get vexatious claims kicked out at relatively low cost, rather than finding yourself swept up in a litigious process with lawyers and fees and all the things that go in that.
Well, we're quickly burning through time, so I'm keen to jump into questions. We've had, I think, over 100 at this point, so we're picking out some of the more interesting ones, and I think the general message from a lot of people is they're sort of asking questions that so I imagine both of you have the answer to, about things that they can do in their own situations. And this one that comes in is quite generally applicable as well. Following the federal court decisions, we have a reader that's written in and essentially asked that they have casuals and whether or not they should be considering offering them a conversion, given the latest news out of the federal court, and sort of broadly what they would need to do to do that. So why don't we start with UK? What would your advice be for SMEs in the realm of casual conversions?
If they've got employees that are working as casuals, have worked with them for longer than 12 months, have worked regular hours and are continuing to work regular hours during that period of time, they should, at the very least, be offering a permanent role. I mean, the legislation sort of says that now, I'd have to say, but the court cases make it significantly, it's in your face now.
Yeah, sure.
But this is what Ed does for a living, so I should defer to him, really.
Sure, yeah. Ed, what's your perspective on this?
So the advice I've been giving businesses is to have an upfront conversation, first of all. I'm not personally prone to, or try not to, and encourage our clients not to just stick their head in the sand on things like this and wait for the employee or the employee's law firm to knock on the door and say, you owe me money. But rather have a conversation and say, look, we're all seeing this on the news. It's controversial. There's lots of talk about it being appealed. There's lots of talk about the government intervening. What I acknowledge is that you might fall in the category of people who might be affected by this. We're going to pause and look at this. I'm not going to rush and make payments for the moment, but we'll keep our eye on it, and let's keep talking, and to avoid either rushing to your checkbook now or burying your head in the sand, but just trying to press the pause button for a moment until we've got more clarity. The one big risk I see, to be honest, and Kate, I'm not sure if you'll agree with this, but what I didn't like about I love JobKeeper as a concept.
I agree. I know what you're going to say, and I agree.
I just worry that we've all, as business owners, had signed a document, if you've applied for JobKeeper, that says these people are regular and systematic casuals.
Yep.
So you've almost just admitted it. And then consequently, those people could say, well, hang on, my employer last week, when they were seeking, and we were encouraged to be helpful to our staff and helpful to our businesses as well, and we've made this admission that these people are essentially entitled to leave, which in itself creates a liability. And I just worry about that wash up, that employees could get quite vociferous if you don't manage the narrative well in explaining that you just need time to see how this is going to work out, and say, well, hang on a second, you told me last week I was regular and systematic. I'm going on leave and you need to pay me for it. That's my concern.
And we've got sort of a related question to that, I suppose. You know, obviously one of the things that these court cases dredged up was sort of how a worker considers their status with their employer. And we've got a questioner here that is asked whether there's any benefit in listing casual loadings as separate lines on their pay slips. I know that WorkPac sort of in their first case, this ended up being something they probably wish they had done, because the court, that was one of the problems with their argument, is the court said that they hadn't made it clear to the worker that they were receiving that casual loading. What are your thoughts around that, Kate, and how specific businesses should be about the various entitlements that they're providing their workers in their communications with them?
Look, I think they should be very definite, you know, that the 25% should be clear, should be on the pay slip, should be clear that what that is for, you know, that it is a casual loading, and being upfront. The dilemma with particularly the last court case is it may not be enough if they're working regular, certain, continuing, predictable, all the words that were talked about. So even if you are clear that it's a 25% loading for casual, you know, for being a casual, if your casual hours are predictable, regular, and so on, it just might not be enough. Right. I don't know what Ed thinks on that, but, you know.
Exactly that.
And interested in your perspective on that.
Yeah, it certainly as a starting point, you should be separating them out. The interest with the Rosato case, because he was receiving more than the award level, there was a point made that you couldn't rely on these overpayments, even beyond the 25% loading, to then say, well, they've been getting so much anyway, can we set that off against how much they might have been paid in annual leave? And the answer was no. It's a separate entitlement for which you have to be paid specifically. So yes, starting point, you need to set out the 25% or whatever the loading is to make sure that it's clear that loading has been paid, but that won't absolve you from them being a casual who may be entitled to annual leave and so on. It's not the cure, unfortunately.
And on that note as well, there was a lot of talk and a lot of questions from our readers as well about who the liability ultimately lies here with. If you're an employer that's working with a labour hire firm or a contracting firm or a temp agency, and you have a number of these workers that might fall into this bucket, who's really on the hook here if there is an issue or workers do want to claim back payments, or you get swept up in one of these class actions? Ed,
do you want to come forward there?
It depends. So in the WorkPac case, WorkPac's a labour hire business. I'd said a great business as well. I happen to have been lucky enough to met the founders there, and they're small business owners that just grew this thing from scratch, this amazing business. And from what I know of them, don't have a bad bone in their body. But they, anyway, they've been caught up in this and they're liable for it because they are the employer of Rosato, as they were of Skeen. So where businesses do have labour hire involvement, I'd be urging them to look at how that's structured. Sometimes labour hire is structured as putting contractors on site. Sometimes it's done through employment relationships. But the short answer is it will always go back to the employer, the person who should have been responsible for paying the wages.
Yeah. And Kate, we have another question here, and this I guess goes to some of the working group discussions that are going to be happening over the next few months. With the sort of question of award simplification that's come up, there are some readers that are perhaps interested in your thoughts on whether, you know, the introduction of a small business award might need to come with some sort of caveat to employees and providing them extra entitlements as part of sort of a meet in the middle consensus approach.
Look, we believe that a small business award is probably going to be a loaded rates approach, where the hourly rate will be actually probably significantly higher than the minimum wage, but there would be a minimum loaded rate which would take into account things like overtime rates and Sunday penalty rates, those sort of things. Sorry, take overtime out, not overtime, but penalty rates. And so, in other words, you're trying to load up the hourly rate so that you don't have to have different rates for different times, for different parts of the week. That's sort of the approach, and to be able to have standard start times, standard break times, all of that sort of stuff. So, and also to be able to move employees between what would have been in the past different awards. In other words, that staff can do multiple tasks in the workplace because they're small businesses. That's how they work. Sure. So it's that sort of approach that we're focusing on.
Sure. And one other thing, this wasn't a question now, but I got an email a bit earlier from a reader, and I was keen to raise this on the call with both of you. There's, I think, a broader concern with these consultations that, they'll be very big business focused in terms of the changes that get made. And I suppose one of the things that Peter Strong, COSBOA's chief, mentioned to me the other day was that there's a third concern for businesses in these negotiations, that you've not only got to come to consensus with the unions, but also with the big business groups. What do you think the prospects are for a solid small business voice in these consultations, and how do you think that needs to happen, Kate? And then I'll go to you, Ed, on that.
Look, if small business is the engine room, as all sides of politics continue to say, then we've got to have an industrial relations system that works for the engine room, not just for big business. And it was interesting. I was speaking to some people who are very vocal in this space the other day, and they really hadn't got their head around the fact that everyone wasn't on an EBA. So, I was saying, but what about all the very large number of award-dependent employees out there that are in the small space? So, although, the better off the boot test, as it's called, is incredibly important for EBAs, there's a whole range of other things that are so important for small businesses. So certainly we, and I know Peter Strong and others, will be waving the flag heavily on this. Most small businesses wouldn't know what an EBA was.
Sure. And Ed, your thoughts on that? They're obviously concerned some of these bigger employer groups with a lot of influence over federal deliberations generally get their ear into these discussions, and sometimes there's less focus on sort of the things that matter to SMEs.
I'm a bit of a cynic, a pessimist, I suppose. I worry that in reality that the working groups are going to struggle to really address those problems for small businesses. I've never been a massive fan about working groups being set up to discuss things, because I just worry that it won't even be compromised, that we just won't address the true problems for small business. So I'm not in that meeting room, so it's easy to sit on the side and throw stones, but it's the reality is this is a very difficult problem to solve. There are so many moving parts to it. It is particularly difficult in Australia because of this fundamental challenge of the wage system. This basic promise between employer and employee, how much do I pay you to do work for me, is so confusing here. And at that starting point, and there's been interestingly, quite a lot of the history of this in the papers over the last couple of days, talking about Bob Hawke and the last accord. And for me, reading that, and you recognise that against what was happening in the UK, say at the time, where Margaret Thatcher was Prime Minister, and it came down quite hard on unionism versus what had occurred here with the Labour Prime Minister at the time. And you can see the two resulting systems where both countries have very low unionism now, but over here, unionism has a much louder voice. And I think the reality is that that voice needs to be heard in Australian politics. It will be heard. And consequently, I don't think you'll see much system level change coming out of these working groups. So I'm not optimistic about seeing much that's really going to help with the kernel of the problem, which is just getting a really simple system so that people can employ more and more people.
Sure. I suppose the concern there, Kate, the government's come out and clarified in the last sort of 24 hours that, you know, they'll put through changes that they want regardless of whether there's agreement, but they would prefer there to be a consensus. What do you really think the prospects are here that we're going to come out of this consultation process with some meaningful reforms on the table, or instead the government will just have to get on with the job, so to speak?
Look, I'm a glass half full sort of a girl. I'm hopeful that that Sally McManus and the union movement will focus on jobs, focus on economic growth and productivity. And she certainly made comments like that. But, you know, Australia's growth over, you know, the 28 years of, 28 consecutive years of growth has really been based for a lot of those years on population increase. Australia's had quite significant population increase, and that's delivered growth. Now, we've had a really flat productivity scenario over the last 10 years or so. So no population growth, in fact, a chunk of people going home. We're going to have to get productive if we're going to, have real productivity increases, if we are planning to have the growth we need to deliver the employment we need. Now, productivity is going to require some real changes, some simplifications, some getting rid of red tape, making it simpler, making it easier to deliver more out of the current unit, all of those things. And that's the challenge here. So the union movement needs to support that, to deliver productivity, to deliver jobs, because there's not going to be another way to do it, really. But whether that's recognised is another issue.
And we've had another interesting question come through that sort of segues out from this nicely, and talking about the Fair Work Commission and its whole role in this. There's obviously been, I think, criticism on both sides of the aisle here of the Fair Work Commission and the role it plays, not just in enterprise bargaining, but with unfair dismissal and things like that. Obviously, they're not directly talking about FWC reform as part of this process, but do you think that ultimately Fair Work Commission reform needs to be part of these productivity and enhancing sort of measures that the government is sort of considering around IR?
Ed, do you want to take that one, or I can, or whatever you like?
Open to the floor, anyone that wants to.
Well, I think one of the interesting ones that's right on our horizon at the moment is the issue of wage increase and the debate around that. And, I'm not an economist, so I'm sure that different views, and probably both perfectly valid ones, as to whether we should have a wage rise or not. As an employer, I could say that sounds quite daunting, that there could be a wage rise. So the Fair Work Commission is the one that considers that based on submissions, and will come to a decision on it imminently. And it will be really interesting for everyone to see what that is. Now, is it right to have that body making those sorts of decisions where in such a fragile economy? I don't know, because they're ultimately for resolving IR disputes. And I have to say, I think they do a pretty good job of that. It's quite a thankless task trying to solve IR issues, given how polarized we sometimes internally call it industrial divorce. Industrial relations, because it's so emotive and people are so polarized by it. And I think on the whole they do a pretty good job of that. But should they be involved in determining wage rates, it will be well, they are. Should they be, and what happens next will be really interesting.
I think that the Fair Work Commission does do a pretty good job, but I think they could do a better job if they had a better concierge service right at the front door.
Right.
Because an awful lot of cases, get to a point of a hearing or a mediation or whatever that have absolutely no substance at all. In fact, I think that the figures are something like, of the 3,500 unfair dismissal claims, only 1% or something like that is actually shown to be unfair. Now, I think that what they could do to make it better is to ensure that the cases that get into the Fair Work Commission are ones that have actual, real grunt and have real facts, and not end up with the unfortunate scenario of go away money that a lot of small businesses will just say, look, they only want $2,000. It's going to take me so much more time and effort than just paying it. It's those things I think the Fair Work Commission could do better.
Right, understand. And we've had another really interesting and quite, I guess, bombastic question come through. One reader asked whether or not, I guess, the recent talk about the IR changes and the federal court decision means that casual work is now effectively dead, or is going to somehow phase out in some kind of significant way unless changes are made. I wanted to get your thought on, I suppose, not just the state of casual work, but really sort of where you see it going, given that there's a lot of uncertainty now from businesses about whether they should even employ casual staff.
Well, I think that if you employ casual staff, you've got to make sure they don't have regular shifts.
Sure.
And they're not predictable or constant or the other.
Right.
So the dilemma is casual still exists and will. The problem is that it's going back to a scenario where fundamentally they're on-demand type workers. They work, on an irregular basis when needed. Now, the problem is that doesn't work for casual workers. Most casual workers are like my mum, who wants to be able to, that I was talking about before, that wants to be able to determine when her casual shifts are going to be so she can organise childcare. I think this is a really, really big problem and a really big step in the wrong direction.
And Ed, your thoughts?
I agree with that. I think that the other scenario that it reminds me of is the issue of contractors versus employees, which has been a hot topic for employers. And this is almost the same problem, which, as Kate points out, if you're going to have casuals, make sure they're doing casual work, essentially, and look carefully at how you're structuring the relationship. And I always use the phrase when advising with clients that if something looks like a duck and quacks like a duck, it's probably a duck. So just if you've got employees that are starting to look pretty permanent in the way they work, in the way they interact with your business, be careful, because that's going to start looking like someone that's going to be attracting entitlements. Same test essentially as you, or same litmus test, I should clarify, if you were looking.
Which is the reason we need a flexible permanent part-time, an approach.
I like that, Kate. Flexi. Sounds like a haircut, but it's good.
It does, sorry, but
what happens there really when you offer a worker who is a casual a conversion to part-time, and that obviously that provision is in most modern awards now, and they say no, I want to stay on the current mechanism. What does that sort of mean for a business in terms of the propensity that they might have to make a back payment, or they might be on the hook for both leave and casual loadings moving forward?
Ed, do you want to go first?
Yeah, so it's an interesting point, because this idea of conversion, which any casual in their right mind at the moment, frankly, if they were regular casuals and there was the predictability and so forth, and you went to them and said, would you like me to cut your pay by 25% and you can have a permanent role? They'd say, why would I? I can have my cake and eat it. I've just read Rosato. That being the case, they're unlikely to agree to it. Fundamentally, they do need to agree to it. You can't unilaterally turn around to your staff member and change their status just because of this decision. And it's a key point to underline, I suppose. And I can't see why they would agree to it at the moment, unless they were so forward thinking that they were saying, I can see that this is going to be damaging to your business and may not be to the long-term health of my job. Other than that, you're going to struggle to convert casuals as the system exists at the moment. Now, whether we could end up in a system where there's almost an auto convert legislated, that's possible, I suppose. But then it would douse the flexibility that people love about being casual. And again, you'd be in a situation where no one's really winning.
Right. And Kate, do you think that there's, I suppose, some concern there that even if businesses did want to make do a casual conversion at the moment, that there's sort of a lack of incentive for workers to even accept that?
Look, I have to say I agree a bit with Ed that employees that have got a bit of a longer term view possibly might, because the thing about casuals, is you can just stop offering them shifts. I mean, at the end of the day, that's the scenario. So, you always take the risk if you stay as a casual that you won't get any more shifts, or over time you'll get less and less. So there's a benefit in being permanent. But my experience running my own businesses is I offered lots of people conversion, and I can't remember anyone saying they wanted 25% less. Or the lack of flexibility. I'm sure there must have been some, but I can't remember any. Right.
Is the likely point of compromise then to emerge out of these casual consults is that sort of unions are perhaps going to ask for some additional pay protections and leave entitlements and maintain some of that loading to some extent, or there'll be some middle ground that will be reached where some version of both is sort of offered to casuals in the end, given the federal courts obviously come down with this decision, Ed?
There needs to be a casual conversion. Seems to be the way that people are leaning towards is some form of solution. So, right. Given that there's rarely going to be a circumstance, I think, where casual conversion meets the needs of both parties. I suspect where it will end up coming down is that there'll be some enforced form of conversion where if you work for a certain period with certain characteristics to your role, that some sort of trigger occurs, if any sort of consensus can be reached. With the alternative being people working out a way to ensure that the triggers towards being a permanent casual, as it's sometimes called, don't occur. So you have a system whereby the allocation of shifts is much more random, so that, or you ask people to work on less consistent days. But a lot of those things are really big business rostering problems. And in small business, when you've got 3 people working for you, you can't ask one of them to do Monday one week and another to do the other to try and avoid the consistency. Right. It's not realistic.
Sure. And Kate, just on that note, we've had a few questions about clarification around what predictable shifts really should look like, or what that is for business owners. What would your thinking be on what a business owner should think of as a predictable shift when they're drawing up their rosters?
The way the court cases have talked about it is if the shifts are agreed in advance and therefore predictable, they fall off. They're in trouble. Right. So if you've said to your casuals, look, you can work 3 mornings a week, the mornings that your mum can look after your kids, and you can do that in the foreseeable future. You might not say, for a year or whatever. You might say we can, you can rely on that. Then you've probably stepped over the line, is the reality. Right. I think the way they're trying to say casual, the casual is your on-demand worker, the one that, that somebody's sick, so you call them in the next day. You've got somebody away on holidays, so you might call in your casuals. It's those sort of, that's regarded as casual. My mum working 3 mornings a week might not cut it under these sorts of, under these court cases anyway.
Okay. It's certainly probably more uncertainty than the other way around at the moment. It'll be very interesting to see how the upcoming consultations might shake some of that uncertainty out, or perhaps even create more of it. But on that note, I think we have run out of time today. Thank you both to Kate Carnell and Ed Mallett for joining us this afternoon. It's been great to have such a broad-ranging discussion across a topic that's very important to businesses across the country. Sorry if we didn't get a chance to answer your question, but please do send us an email and we'll endeavour to get back to you in due course. But on that note, let's wrap things up and let both of you get back to your days. Is there any final things you wanted to say, or?
Look, I'd just like to say, this is an opportunity at the moment to actually get an industrial relations system that works for, the million employing small businesses that are out there. And gee whiz, we've got to grab it, because I can't see how we can really get our economy really firing again unless we get this right. Sure.
Annette?
I think if we've learned nothing else today, it's that I'm a grumpy pessimist and Kate's an optimist, and which is why she's in her role. And I'm going to follow Kate behind that sentiment and say that let's hope for that, putting my pessimism aside for a moment.
Well, it certainly will be interesting. I don't know if I'm a really pessimist or an optimist. I just like observing. But thank you, everybody who's tuned in today for the webinar. We really appreciate you coming along and hearing from both Kate and Ed. On that note, I'll let you all go and get back to your day. Thanks very much.
Thanks.
Thank you,
everyone.